Wait. Oh, I'm recording. Okay. Yes. And my camera should be working. Here we are. Okay, good. All right. So now we go into, my camera's blurry. Now we go into post-development. All right. I think we all figured out the difficulty of making the postmodern turn, right? It's difficult actually to listen to someone else and really be attentive to the environmental resources, to the cultural resources. There's one story that I wanted to, it could have been a case study that you do, but there's not enough people. But here's a story that illustrates very well how when we don't listen to the local culture, we actually we set ourselves up for failure. So there was a community, it might have been in Kenya. This is a story I believe that Wangari Maathai tells us. But I'm not sure. Wangari Maathai, you know, of course, the activist, the Kenyan activist for the environment. So she describes there was a lumber company who wanted to, you know, of course, develop in a region of Kenya. And one of the trees that is prominent, I'm not sure if it's in Kenya now. And so one of you will have to help me with the details, right? But there's a sacred tree that is not allowed to cut, right? And maybe one of you knows the name of that tree, if you're familiar with the story. And so, of course, the communities were saying, please don't cut down our sacred tree, right? But the lumber company was like, you know, these are superstitions, you know, people need to evolve, people need to progress, they need to modernize. They cut down everything, including the sacred tree. And shortly after, there was a terrible drought in the community, right? All of a sudden, all the streams dried up, all the crops dried up, and the community, of course, was saying, see, you cut down the sacred tree, now the ancestors are angry, and they're cursing us with this drought, right? Anybody know how they resolved, what was the problem? Anybody knows this story? And if you know the name of the tree, that's a bonus.
I know the name of the tree.
Okay, what's the tree?
It's called Mugumo tree.
Guma, okay. Are you the Kenyan?
Yes, this is Willis.
Are you? Willis, right? Okay, very good. Excellent. And what is the property of that tree?
The tree is found in a certain community. The community which is mentioned in the book which you gave us to read, that is where we find that particular tree. And this tree is very important among the Agikuyu community in Kenya because it symbolizes many things. It symbolizes even leadership. Like, you know, the Kikuyu community are the ones who have been leading Kenya for a number of years. The first president was from that community. The current president is also from that community. But recently, those trees are many. It's not just one, and they are only found within the area where the Kikuyu community live. Recently, one of them fell down on its own recently, and then the fear among the Kikuyu communities that now they are going to lose leadership in the next election, which is coming in 2022. So that is how this tree is treated in that community. It is held as a very, very important tree in terms of many aspects of life.
Very good. So thank you for the, finally, Muguma. Can you put it in the chat, spell it in the chat for me so I can put it in my notes so I know how to spell it. Now there's something else about that tree which explains the drought. It's not the ancestors, right? The tree actually has very deep roots, right? And so this is a tree that captures water very powerfully, much more than other trees because it has such deep roots. And so when you cut down that tree, you're basically cutting down the ability of the environment to catch water. And so, of course, when the tree was cut down, the roots died. And so all the water that came during the rainy season and so forth would just flow away, wouldn't stay in the land in order to nurture the crops, right? So there was actually a scientific explanation, right? But the local cultures somehow knew we cannot cut down this tree. So even if it felt irrational, right, that, this is stupid superstition, right, what ancestors, right? And so even though felt to an outsider like a superstition, actually there was a deep wisdom in that particular reveration, right, worship of that particular tree, Mugumo tree. Okay, I'm writing it down from, okay, Shumko, go ahead. No question.
I think, I mean, any Western engineer or anyone who goes and decides to cut down trees should actually think about whether it has some sort of impact on the environment. So I don't think it's just the local community knowledge, but it's just to some extent common sense from the design perspective.
Yeah. Absolutely. So of course, an attunement to the environment, to look at the environment, what kind of environment, to be connected to what's going on. And of course, what's interesting is that this local tradition, which feels irrational, actually had wisdom in it, right? So very often the idea here is that we despise culture, we despise local cultures, but sometimes there is some wisdom that if we listened, right, we would be able to gain from it. Okay, I just wanted to add that in conclusion to the case studies. Now let's go into the third part of our class, which is post-development. And this is a very interesting section, right? We are progressing ethically, I hope you notice, from theory of modernization. Postmodern turn is better, right? There's more connection to the other. But when we go into post-development, we're going to see that it goes even further in terms of ethics. So let me summarize, and then we're going to read a number of quotes by the thinker Escobar, who is the one who really writes about post-development. I'll introduce him in a second, but let me summarize, right? Basically what Escobar is going to tell us. So let me tell you a few words about Escobar so you know who he is. Oh, I didn't do my research. Okay. Main thing I know right now, you can look him up, is that Escobar, and it would be nice to have them, I need to really find out, but he's one of the main, right now, development ethicists, right? You hear about him everywhere. He wrote a number of interesting books on the ethics of development. And I'm looking here, the title of his book here is Encountering Development. So this is really, and then there is a book where he writes, there's an essay where he is really imagining, right? It's entitled Imagining a Post-Development Era. So he's actually going to be very critical, not only of the way development occurs, but of development itself, right? He's going to say this whole system of NGOs, donors, aid is all messed up, is perverted, right? So there's several Escobars, right? I always mix them up. So I have to look up exactly who the first name is. Or can you tell how based on the books?
I'm just joking. Pablo Escobar was one of the most famous drug dealers.
I know. You have several, like, so when I Google him, I had all the drug dealer, right? And then there's a couple of writers also that are same name. But is it Pablo Escobar, the first name? No, I need to check. Can someone check for me on your phone? What is the exact first name of this guy based on the books? Pedro?
Arturo.
Oh, Arturo, thank you. Arturo Escobar, right? I know Escobar is very famous in the United States for the drugs, and we have a show on Netflix, and exactly. So Arturo Escobar, right? And you can look on the Wikipedia, see more about him, but he really is one of the most critical philosophers of development. And so the reason for this is that he says, yeah, development, even development that is listening to the beneficiary, there is still in the whole culture of development, culture of aid, there is still an inequality that is maintained. So I think, I'm always trying to remember, I think, where are you? Kayumba, you mentioned this. The dependency, there's still a hierarchy. Even if we sit down with the local communities to listen, often it is a fake listening. Very often the whole culture of aid creates dependency. So he's talking about that. So he has two criticisms. Number one, the culture of dependency. We're going to see this in the text. And number two, the culture of hierarchy, right? When you talk about expert, listen, look at the language, right? Expert versus beneficiary. Who's more powerful, to use the word that Kayumbe likes the most? Who's most powerful, the expert or the beneficiary?
Expert.
Exactly. Expert is up here.
Experts.
Exactly. You have the expert up here, beneficiary down here with the hand like this, right? And so he's saying, even if we, play act, this listening, he's saying still we are maintaining the inequality. We are maintaining the dependency. We are not really creating equality. And so he's actually going to criticize the whole aid culture, the whole terminology, attitude, worldview of aid, right, of development. And so let's do a little bit of that right now. Let's look at the language even that we use in development context, like expert, beneficiary. Let's give me some words, some concepts that are used on a daily basis by you, which is maintaining this inequality, this hierarchy. Let's hear from you a little. You can put them in the chat if you don't want to talk. Shumko. Go ahead, Shumko.
Oh, that was a hand from previous thing.
What I saw.
But I have suggestions for the opposite.
Yes.
The stakeholder.
Okay, so they're trying to change the language, right? They're using the word stakeholder, client, right? But it's still the notion. So yeah, they're making an effort, but you're still in this culture of the donor, the sponsor, right? The NGO. They're still, right? Even if you change the language, which we still need to change a lot more, right? You still have this culture of dependency. Yeah, we call them stakeholders, but are they really stakeholders? Right? You have to ask whether the language corresponds to the reality, right? But let's look at some of the other words that haven't yet shifted. What are they? You can put them in the chat. I'm going to put them for you in the chat if you say them. How do we call the nations that are not Western?
Underdeveloped?
Yes.
Underdeveloped?
This
Great
is a
word.
great concept. Underdeveloped. Who decides? Right? In the name of what are certain nations underdeveloped, developed, civilized, not civilized, right? This is a concept which in a way paralyzes you, right? Oh, I am an underdeveloped nation, poor me, I have nothing, right? It brings you down, right? What else? What other concepts can we have? Do we use on a daily basis without thinking? So we have underdeveloped. Third world, very good. Why the third world? Who is the first? Who decides this is the third world, right? Shumko, your hand is raised for good reason.
I have an example. For example, indicators for, let's say, well, it's a real example we have. So USAID, they have a special indicator for wash activities, and one indicator is how many times people have to wash their hands a day, or where did they last defecate. And while in some communities it might work, for Syria, which is very developed, and it was doing very well 10 years ago, in the peak of its economy, going and asking this question, and actually the basis of the hygiene promotion is to teach them to wash hands. Our staff were saying, no, like, this is ridiculous, everyone knows they need to wash hands and stuff. So it was difficult to, I mean, they had this, the indicator is still there, you still have to collect data and provide the data for it. But what we realized, and we tried to argue back to the donors, saying that we don't need to teach them how to wash hands, we need to teach them or help them to adapt to new situations, because they had to leave their homes. There's a lot of internally displaced people and stuff. But I mean, the mentality is just different. I mean, mentality of the donor is just that you don't know, you have to know, and it's difficult to get them to adjust. I mean, it's a long process for them to adjust as well, because it's a whole system of indicators and stuff. But it's difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's still, there's a long way to go to understand how to deal with, even with developed communities. They still just, it's assumed that they're not developed enough.
Right, exactly, right? So you see how the language can actually give a perception that is not connecting to the actual value or empowerment of the community, right? So we have a few more in the chat that came up, right? Vulnerable people is a good one, right? Again, we see them as weak and fragile and they need help, right? We have it in the chat, we have also poor nations. Now, 1040 window, is that demeaning in any way? And north-south, I'm wondering, Cole, if you're seeing any type of demeaning, because right, what Escobar is saying is that these words are demeaning. How would 1040 window or north-south be demeaning? Go ahead.
1040 window is used usually in the Christian church, that this part of the globe needs to be evangelized.
I see, I see, I see. Okay, all right. But the word itself is not derogatory, right? That's the point I'm making. It's not inherent in the word that it is like when you say poor nation, okay, immediately it's derogatory. So I'm looking for concepts that we use all the time, which actually are derogatory, which actually keep one down, which actually makes one into a victim, or it changes the character of the person you're talking about. Does that make sense, Cole?
Yeah.
North-south, perhaps, because the South now more and more has the connotation as
North, like east and west.
Yes, that would, because we do associate the West with, certain connotation, the East. So that might work, yes. Then
So
we
we
have
change to north and south.
North and South, I think might work. Although in itself, North and South, there is nothing wrong, right, with the word itself. So yes, we have less privileged countries. Beneficiaries, obviously, is a big one, right? Where you have, they are benefiting. and even though we're trying to change into client and stakeholders, it's still, right? But it's a good effort, right? So are you seeing how in the whole, just the language, right? It creates an atmosphere, it creates a reality of dependency. When you say expert, beneficiary, when you say low income, high income, developed, less developed, you are creating a reality, which might not have to be, which might not really correspond to the actual state of things, right? So let's look a little bit at what Escobar is talking about, right? Let's go to page 7. 7 on the syllabus, and this is the second quote. Who would like to be our Escobar for today? I'm going to have one person read all of these. So who would like to be the Escobar of the day? Cole, you will be the Escobar. So we start with the second paragraph on page 7. You have it? Unmute yourself. You're muted.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Second paragraph 2.
Page 7.
Okay. Development can be described as an apparatus that links form of knowledge about the third world with the deployment of forms of power and intervention, resulting in the mapping and production of third world societies. By means of this discourse, individuals, governments, and communities are seen as underdeveloped or placed under conditions in which they tend to see themselves as such, and are treated accordingly.
Okay, excellent. So here we see the point that I think Kayumba made earlier, right? Let me make sure I have the right name. Kayumba, yes. He made this point about the dependency, right? He's saying knowledge is linked to power. In other words, how we talk about you is going to create power in us, right? So the way we conceptualize these societies, in a way, maintains a certain balance of power. So if I conceptualize or represent you as needy, vulnerable, beneficiary, poor, in need of aid, then I can then come in and, right? Then it creates a hierarchy, and it creates a dependency. If I am vulnerable and poor, of course I need you, right? But if I am powerful, why would I need you, right? So the language, he's saying, our language is creating a state of dependency. We are creating the problem with our language. That's basically what he's saying. Development is creating its own problem so that it can come and solve it, right? So in a way, it's very powerful. So that's what he means by forms of knowledge, right? The way we represent or conceptualize the third world, quote unquote, is actually creating a balance of power, is creating dependency. And then he says, we are mapping and producing these societies as such. We are making them vulnerable and poor with our words. Perhaps they're not vulnerable. Perhaps they're not poor. Perhaps they have all the resources they need, but now they're used to hearing themselves as poor and vulnerable. So now, like Kayumba was saying, they become like that community he mentioned, which is saying, but where is the NGO? We cannot do this without the NGO, right? And so forth. Very good. Any questions and comments on this particular paragraph or experiences you want to share connected to this that we just read? Okay, Kayumba, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the ideas you shared with us. And so, but my question, most of us here, we are development actors, or we have a passion or interest in development. So what can you suggest to us as people who are interested in development of our community or the development of the world? What can you suggest? What can we do? There is that dependence theory at some point, which is fair because people with power, they don't want to lose it. So for me, I don't blame them. I just have to learn from them. What can you propose, especially linking it to ethics? What can you propose to us as a learning lesson from those old theory, or what can we do so that all because, for example, for us, we are in those countries called 30 worlds or and developed countries. What can you suggest that at least our people can copy with those powers of Babel?
Yes, so I think it's already been done to a certain extent. It's the notion of sustainable development in the sense that we help, people might need a momentary impulse, but eventually they have to become autonomous, right? So these are NGOs who actually work to the point where they want to leave the community after a few years because the community has become self-reliant. So there are actually NGOs which are trying to make the community self-reliant and whose goal is to leave, right? One of them is called, that I saw was Afrikids. I don't know if you're familiar. This is in Ghana. This is a community that helped with schooling and so forth. And their goal was to actually, within 5 years, they had a 5-year plan where after 5 years, the school would be sustainable and they could leave the country and go to another one, right? So that's one way. But what Escobar is proposing, and this is the second thing, is a culture of partnership, a real partnership. And so we'll talk about that in a second. Actually, let me talk about it now since I'm responding to you. So Escobar is criticizing, but he's also proposing, right? So first of all, we have the criticism in Escobar, criticism of the terminology, right? Which maintains the inequalities. And number two, he's talking now about a culture of partnership. So in other words, what he's saying is that we have to create, of course, sometimes aid is needed, right? But ultimately, we have to get to the point, he says, where those persons are not only self-reliant, but they're enriching us, right? They're able to offer something to us, right? So he's talking more about a business model, right? Just like when you have a business, like I have I don't know, food, and you have clothing, then I give you food, you give me clothing, right? So he's saying we need to develop business relationships between the West and the African continent or Latin America, but fair business relationships, right? In other words, right now it's not fair. They take maybe 1,000 pounds of raw materials for a tiny little gadget that they manufacture in the north, right? So there needs to be, he's saying that the countries that are called third world actually have things to offer, if even just in terms of raw material, right? But he's saying the market has to become more fair. I give you this, you give me that, right? So that he's talking more about going towards a business model where we have a more fair exchange, which we do not have right now. And that way, what they're lacking, they can have on the basis of this exchange. Does that make sense a little bit, Kayumbe?
Yes. Yes, it makes sense.
Okay, so let's continue reading. Still Escobar, right? So we have our Escobar of the day, which is Cole. Go ahead, next paragraph.
Escobar. Although couched in terms of humanitarian goals and the preservation of freedom, the new strategy sought to provide a new hold on countries and their resources. The infantilization of the third world was integral to development as a secular theory of salvation.
Okay, good. So here we have a few ideas, right? This is again what Kayumba was saying, that, you know, they come with humanitarian mask, right? We're going to help you, but deep down, it is about the power. As long as you're dependent, I can control you, right? So, and he's saying we have infantilized, or made like an infant, like a baby, the third world. We have given them the mindset of dependency. Whether it's Latin America or the continent of Africa, this mindset of dependency is what needs to change before anything can happen, right? Okay, continue, Escobar of the day.
Since the mid and late 1980s, a relatively coherent body of work has emerged which highlights the role of grassroots movements, local knowledge, and popular power in transforming development. The authors representing this trend state that they are interested not in development alternatives, but in alternatives to development. That is, the rejection of the entire paradigm altogether.
So he's pretty radical, right? He's saying we need to not just make development better, we need to get rid of development. That's what he means when he says we don't want development, hold on. Yeah, we don't want development alternatives, right? In other words, a better way to develop, like using the word stakeholder or using the word, you know, client. We want alternatives to development, right? We want something new, another way to do things, which he in this whole book, right? He says we need to work on the business model where we have a fair exchange, where they have something to offer and we give them fair exchange for what they have. We give them what we have, right? So, and both are being enriched, both are benefiting. It's not just I am giving you, we are both benefiting from each other. Cole, you raised your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, in that context, would you consider contractualization or like Cardno, for example?
Explain a little bit, because I don't know what it is.
Cardno is a hybrid NGO private company.
Okay.
Like DFAT, for example, from Australia, they would prefer giving their money to DFAT, to Cardno or RTI. These are not non-governmental organizations, but for profit and private companies.
Yeah, I think he's looking not at the business model we have now, where we have massive exploitation. He's talking about if we were to develop more fair business models, business partnerships, it would be much more beneficial than this continuous flow of aid, right? So in other words, come in as a corporation, I get something, you get something, but we both get equal. There's none of this exploitation. So he's really talking about creating a fair business model, right? Instead of this kind of one-sided aid. I think we have a hand by Hao. Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, is this even possible, even in the theoretical sense? I mean, I'll give you an example. So when I was in Sudan, there was a woman who was there who had kids the same age as mine. We had a lot in common. We got to be friends. But she was the head of mission for ECHO, and I was an ADRA country director. There was a definite imbalance of power in our relationship because she controlled a lot of money, which I applied for sometimes. And although we were good friends and, you know, would go to parties and things, there was always something there that we both knew that she had more power than I did. And, you know, it was a similar dynamic between the country of Sudan and the European Union. There was just more stuff in the EU than in Sudan. And as long as there are inequalities, there will be imbalance of power. And as long as there's imbalance of power, we can talk about our terminology, we can talk about partnerships, we can talk about fair business, but it's always slanted. It's never flat somehow. I don't know, maybe I'm just talking ridiculousness, but I felt that, you know, there were people I wanted to be their friends, but then, yeah, no can do.
Right. No, it's not easy, right? Obviously, where we are starting from, well, I might not even say we're starting from inequality. We are starting from perceived inequality, because just the fact she had more money doesn't mean that you are unequal. You might have more ideas, you know? So this idea that just because someone has more money, they're higher on the hierarchy is, for me, that's a construction. That's a construct. We have created this concept that if you have more material wealth, you're superior. Why? Some countries have more spiritual wealth, right? So I think what I like about what he's saying is that we are creating the inequality based on, you know, oh, bigger, more wealth here, more money here, less money here, therefore, but why are we defining things like that? Maybe there are, I mean, in terms of weather, you know, there's a huge inequality from the north and the south, right? Why don't we see that as a wealth? In terms of quality of life, in terms of community, in terms of, you know, even ethics, you know, we need to define things differently. If we look in terms of community, as the West, we're failing. We're way behind. We have no more communities, finished, right? In terms of spiritual values, we are falling behind. So we are judging according to a certain criteria. Why can't we change the criteria? Why couldn't you see yourself how, I'm going to bash you a bit, right? As an equal in terms of, maybe I don't have as much money, but I have something else to offer, right? So that's what I'm saying. Let's be careful not to create inequalities that aren't there. Or that might be there on one level, but not on another level, right? Am I making sense? How am I making sense? You're shaking your head no. I was not convincing you, how?
No.
No, I'm not sold. I think, you know, basically the people who have money or resources that can be easily transferred into financial instruments are the ones who make the rules. And because they make the rules, whatever the game is, they win. So I'm not saying that spiritual things have no value, but Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. So these sort of things are valuable, but they may not help us right in this life per se.
I guess I would continue to object, right? I have a vision of if there was not this dependency, we wouldn't be worried about who makes the rules, right? I think what Cole is saying here in the chat, right? The debtor is a slave to the lender, but I think it is possible, and some countries have tried that in the continent of Africa, to be completely self-reliant, and therefore nobody makes the rules for you anymore. I'm looking, for example, at Rwanda. Right? I greatly admire the president of Rwanda. I know the West doesn't like him. They see him as a dictator. But for me, he's an absolute philosopher king, right? This is an intellectual who's in control. So he is despised by the West because he doesn't follow their rules, right? But on the other hand, if you create enough self-reliance, you don't have it anymore to follow the rules of the most wealthy countries, right? You can create your own rules. So I do envision a world where even if there is a discrepancy in minimum wage or wealth, you can still be, right? You can still create this situation where you are not inferior, it's just different, right? For example, the minimum wage, I'm just looking at the United States, right? In New York City, you have to make a huge amount of money to pay rent. So if I compare myself to somebody who lives, I don't know, in Kansas, I am actually, seems like much wealthier than that person in Kansas because I make more because of the rent. But actually, relatively speaking, they're happy in Kansas and I'm happy in New York, right? They pay less rent. They have a lot of advantages of having a lower salary, right? And we're both equally happy in our own way. We have both equal dignity, even though technically I make more, right? So that's the idea, that why can't we reformulate in our minds what a different criteria for equality, perhaps well-being or happiness. I think Nepal is doing some of that, instead of strictly seeing everything in terms of material wealth like we are doing as typical Westerners. So I still beg to differ. I still beg to differ that we need to reformulate the criteria as we use to define who is equal and who is unequal. Let's go to a couple more people. Manze, Shumko, and Kayumba. Go ahead.
Yes, I think the issue of hierarchy is not only created by the Europeans. Even in Africa, where you see people are very poor, still people are not treated the same. If you find somebody who have maybe 100 head of cattle, you see himself as higher than the one who have like maybe 5 head of cattle. So it is something to do with the human nature, the way I see. But though we are trying to, to minimize that and to see that we are equal and we should be treating ourselves equally. It is something to do with humanity. Not only the thing that is created by Europeans,
Right.
but
Right.
that's the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. The thing is, of course, is to realize when there is this comparison, is it a legitimate comparison? Is there an inequality or simply a difference? Right? And I still stand my ground. I think that you can have differences in wealth or even power and still have this kind of, well, I have my, I don't feel like I am inferior to you, right? In a way. Where are we? We have Shumko and Kayumba. Go ahead.
I agree with your point about comparing and feeling inferior, but at the same time, one group of people would have more access to education, higher opportunities, and better resources, while the other group of people may not have that. Yet they're still as smart as the other group, but they just don't have the opportunity, they don't have the resources, they don't have access to resources. So this puts them in the box of inequality, which they can't climb out from unless they get some support. And I think to some extent the idea of humanitarian work is to provide that, to give people opportunity to do what they want to do, and provide them with the resources to do that. I don't know if you remember, if you've ever seen that picture, like there's a wall and there are people different heights and standing trying to look over the wall, and then so what the question is, do they all get the same opportunity, or do some get a little bit more resources in order to reach where they want to go? So this is kind of the dilemma here.
So I want to follow up on what you're saying, because you're talking about they have no education, no opportunities, no resources, but you're thinking of a Western concept of education, a Western concept of opportunity, a Western concept of happiness. And of course, when you judge against this Western concept, they're not cutting it, right? And this is the issue. The reason I'm speaking so adamantly is because I'm thinking of the movement of feminism. I'll give you an example of this, right? So we do not, we have a hard time as Westerners to accept that there are other forms of education, other forms of opportunities, and other forms of well-being. This is one of the texts that we won't read, but you can read on your own, is the criticism of Muslim women of the Western feminism, right? Western feminism comes into Muslim countries and tells the women, you need to drive, you need to wear what you want, take off the hijab, right? You need to be making your own decisions, your own person. And there's actually a backlash from these Muslim women who say, you are imposing on us a Western concept of freedom, a Western concept of agency, a Western concept of happiness, whereas we are quite happy in your perceived oppression. We are happy in this situation. We feel like we have agency. We feel like we have freedom. And so this is what I'm seeing so very often. We compare, the criteria is always a Western criteria. And of course, non-Western countries don't live up to that, but they have their own criteria of well-being, of education and opportunity. And this is what I'm suggesting. If that criteria was to be rediscovered, there wouldn't be a need to raise people up. Do you see what I'm saying? Am I making sense, Shumko?
Yes, but at the same time, if you look at the poor community, and if you just leave them alone, they will continue the same way. So they need, I mean, maybe I am thinking from just the Western perspective, saying that they need some sort of intervention to be supported, but what I'm trying to say is that in terms of future, they will survive, they will be fine, but there will still be, the gap will still be between the rich and the poor. The countries will still be very high if they're just left alone.
So again, I have to stop you. The gap between the rich and the poor. What defines rich and poor? Pure material wealth, GDP, right? But must that be the criteria? Is there not a way to be wealthy in a non-material way, right? Do we have to have, 3 cars, 2 garages to be really happy? So this is, I mean, we're going to read when we talk about the environment, right? Why are we focused? Right now, we are dividing the world in material concept of more wealth, less wealth. And we're creating this hierarchy. And my criticism of that is that we are defining well-being in terms of material wealth, whereas there are many, many different forms of well-being, of education, of opportunities that don't have to match up, right, to the Western criteria. Let's read briefly. I want you to see this, what I'm trying to say in the text. Go to page 9. I wasn't going to read the text here, but I want
Professor, I had the
Hold on. I'm sorry. We have to move on. Especially since I'm running out of juice. Let's just read the text and then I'll get the rest of the hand here. I just want to drive home this point of the way that we sometimes impose the criteria of what it means to be developed, what it means to be civilized, whereas there are other ways, right? So let's read, who would like to read the last paragraph of page 9? And then I'll get the other questions. I just want to drive this point home. Who would like to read this? Adamovich, why don't you, or who else? Somebody volunteered?
Yeah, I did. I volunteered this.
Okay, go ahead, Willis. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
The last paragraph. We need to confront 2 more big issues. First, the acceptance of the possibility of differences. Can we only free Afghan women to be like us, or might we have to recognize that even after liberation from the Taliban, they might want different things than we would want for them. Can there be a liberation that is Islamic? And beyond this, is liberation even a goal for which all women or people strive? Are emancipation, equality, and rights part of a universal language that we must use? In other words, might other desires be more meaningful for different groups of people? Living in close family, living in godly way, living without war. I don't know of many women having expressed envy of US women, women they tend to perceive as bereft of community, vulnerable to sexual violence and social enemy, driven by individual success rather than morality, or strangely disrespectful of God.
Okay, you see there, right, how Western feminists come into a Muslim country and they have this clear view that all women need emancipation, equality, rights, and they want to bring this, of course, to these women who are living under the rule of the Taliban, which is the worst possible rule for us Westerners, right? And here, this Muslim woman, right, this is a Muslim woman writing, and the title, of course, is Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving? She's saying, we have a completely different paradigm for well-being. And you're imposing your paradigm for well-being on us when we actually might not need liberation. We don't care about emancipation or equality or rights, at least from her vantage point, right? So this is just to show that very often we have this Western criteria of what it means to be happy or developed. And of course, when we come with the Western criteria, everybody falls short. But perhaps we need to formulate a criteria. People or different nations, non-Western nations, need to formulate their own criteria. And then there is not a question of hierarchy, there's simply a question of different paradigms, right? Am I making sense? Can you put your hand in the screen if you're seeing kind of what I'm saying? At least, even if you don't agree completely, you're kind of seeing the point. Okay, now there were a couple more. Kayumba and Shumko. Let's start with Kayumba. Go ahead, Kayumba.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. Can you hear me well now?
I hear you really good.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much. Actually, the way of equality, I like the way that you have that mindset. But I think that mindset is biblical mindset. Probably will be equal in heaven. But in this world, the law that all proposed, the golden law, those who have goals, they make laws. There is no other option. So that is why people with power, they have to give us the laws to follow. And also I like the idea that you appreciate our president, especially because I'm from Rwanda. But because of his spirit, always they criticize him that he's a dictator, you see? But there is a line he can't, if those people with power, or those Western countries, powerful people, they set lines. Every president of these under or third world countries, he can't cross that line. If he crossed that line, OTAN come up with the weapons and fires. For example, Gaddafi, his people was among the best people who have good life in this world. But because he wanted independence from those Western countries, you can see what OTAN did for him. So what I mean here, let us wait in heaven, maybe we can expect equality. But on this world, we have to think deeply about the golden laws and the power. We have to cooperate with those powerful people. Otherwise, we have choice. We have two choices: to fight with them or cooperate with them. And to fight with them is very dangerous because they already have power. Now they have weapons, they have biological weapons, they have everything. So the only option is to cooperate with them. And the cooperation is at some point following their laws. Otherwise, OTAN will come up with big fires on your countries. Yeah, that was my. Otherwise, we can expect the equality in heaven. Indeed, God is very difficult. Maybe we can pray. Even God don't want people who, even God make a division at Babel, so he didn't want people to have more power. The Western countries, I think they have that mindset. That is what I think.
Okay, yes, absolutely. So you're right. You have this notion we have to a certain degree bend. But I wonder. But we have to talk about this more later. I wanted to just point out one example you mentioned about your president, right? Which is criticized for being a dictator. So this is a Western idea that a president should have only 4-year term. And that's how it should be, or maybe 8 years, right? If he's reelected. And we think this is the right way, and this is the fair way, and we think that Rwanda should do the same. Now, we are not aware of the history, clearly, of Rwanda, where there was so much instability during the genocide that somebody had to rise up and stabilize the country and be a stabilizing force. So as far as I see it, the president of Rwanda is not a dictator, he's a stabilizing force, right? But the West has a hard time seeing alternative models as equal, right? The West needs everything to be like itself to be seen as equal, right? There are some countries that need, perhaps for a while, a dictatorship, like the kind of Rwanda, which I wouldn't call a dictatorship because the Rwandan country is not under oppression, right? By the president. There's no oppression there. So that's why this is a perfect example of how the West is dictating what is the right thing.
Professor, but that example is not fair, because if you can see Germany, Angela Merkel had 4 terms. So they just come with those laws just on Africa because we are powerless. Why they didn't ask Angela Merkel, why is not on power for 4 terms? Huh?
It's not the same.
You get a point.
It's not 20 years though, right? Kagame has been there for 20 years, I think, or so.
But he was elected by his people.
Oh, yeah, over and over again.
The Rwandan people decided that. Yeah. So Angela Merkel also, he's on power for 4 terms. So
yeah, I feel you.
And Putin, yes, Sophia, thank you.
I feel you.
So if Russian people decide that Putin stay on power, that is their choice. So, but why they didn't say something to Putin? Because Putin is powerful.
Yeah.
They fear him. So
I get it.
They just talk to our president because they think that Rwanda is still powerless. It's not like Russia, it's not like Germany.
Yeah.
I think,
right. You have a point. You have a point. We are think of also of the International Criminal Court. The only people who are on trial are non-Western nations, right? It's always some African leader or some Asian leader. Never you will have, for example, George Bush. That would be nice, to have somebody from the United States or Europe. So it's the same. You're right. I think you're right with this notion of a balance of power. Yeah, absolutely.
And George Bush might be the good candidate for that court.
I think so too. So sorry to the Republicans of
because of Iraq.
Yeah, exactly. This is an illegal war, and there was massive destruction of civilians and torture. There were a lot of problems in that war, right? So absolutely. But if we just think in terms of development, right? We're talking more on the level of the NGO culture, right? What Escobar is saying is that the NGOs need perhaps to shift their mindset from this kind of hierarchy, mindset, and also this kind of mindset that the criteria has to be Western, right? So this is, I think, the text we're doing here is more on the NGO level, trying to shift the consciousness of the people who are bringing aid. For the political stuff, you will have to take the class in, I think it's called, what is the class that you guys have on politics in this program? What is it called? Anybody knows? You guys are at the end. You should have taken this class already.
Public policy.
Yes, foreign policy. There you can have more of a political discussion, right? Here we are on the level of ethics. So it's more here in this class we are talking more about the ideals we should strive for the best we can, right? Even if they are not realistic, we should still be journeying towards those ideals, right? I think we need to understand that this class is practical in the sense of where we are, the direction we're taking, not necessarily in the sense that we will succeed, but we need to begin journeying intellectually towards a more ethical approach to development, right? So obviously, practically speaking, is hard because we're moving towards it. But I agree with you. I keep on forgetting your name. It's terrible, Kayumba. That we cannot reach this destination, but we have to begin to journey towards this destination. Okay, I think we can take a short break before we go. I want to make sure we finished with Escobar. I think we're good. Yeah, let's take a short break because I want to go to finish with the development, the African way. But you guys haven't had a break yet. How are you feeling on a scale from 1 to 10? 10 being you're feeling great, 1 being you're feeling horrible. 5, oh, 10, Cole is feeling great. Okay, what else? 3, oh my God, Peterson. Peterson is just dissolving in front of us. Adamovich, 4, not far from Peterson. Okay, imagine how I'm feeling, right? I'm the one doing all the talking. So, all right, let's take let me stop the recording.